welcome to the Innovation and Diffusion podcast. I'm Ruveyda Gozen, an assistant professor at the Cardiff Business School and a research associate at the LSE. And today we have Robin Burgess as our guest. Welcome, Robin. How are you?
I'm good, thank you.
So let me introduce you to our audience. So Robin is a professor of economics at the LSE, and he is the co-founder and the director of the International Growth Center. And his main interests are environmental and development economics and political economy. And today we will talk a lot about green innovation, the tension between economic growth and degrowth idea, and the climate tension as well. And what are the obstacles? What are good examples? And then we will also go into some gaps in the literature or maybe new data sets and other kinds of things related to research. I must say I'm very excited to have you as a guest because one of my favorite papers was your paper when I was a PhD student. We were taking a development economics course taught by Benjamin Feigenberg at the University of Illinois at Chicago, and in that course we were reading your paper, and I was very amazed by the idea and the data used in that paper. Just to let our audience know, it was related to deforestation and political economy in Indonesia. And the findings were showing the importance of local incentives in terms of illegal logging and deforestation. And one of the probably most striking aspects of the paper was this relationship, and at the same time, the satellite data used to identify deforestation or illegal logging, which I found really amazing. And at the time I was very much amazed by it. I grew up in Turkey, and since my childhood, I think we've heard so many cases where there is a fire in a forest where you could say lungs of, Turkey, and then somehow a hotel is built immediately after the fire. And you don't know if there are any investigations later on. And then you just know that the hotel was built or there were other kinds of things. So it was very cheeky. So in that sense, I could really kind of relate to that paper, and it was one of my favorite. So maybe let's start talking about this paper. So how did you come up with that idea? Let's start with that, and then let's go into the data you used and how you built that network.
Thank you very much for having me on the podcast. My first degree before I went into economics was in biology, and as a kid growing up in East Africa and the Philippines, I had a real kind of interest in natural history. So I was already kind of more attuned to biology and natural history, but most of my early work was in political economy. And I think it was when I was visiting Berkeley, which is about 19 years ago, because I remember my daughter was 6 weeks old, my first daughter, when we went out there. And I'd gotten to know Michael Greenstone there, who was also visiting, and at the same time, Ben Olkin, who was sitting next to me when I visited the MBR a year or two before that. I got to know Ben. He knew about Indonesia. And we just got very interested in essentially the big question of why deforestation was so much more rapid in the band kind of around the equator. So the big forests there, the Amazon, the Congo Basin, and then Indonesia. And because he knew about Indonesia, we were like, okay, let's work on Indonesia. But Indonesia also had the advantage that there'd been a lot of political churn. So there'd been, after the dictatorship, there's a huge decentralization. So the central question we were really asking there was political decentralization good or bad for deforestation? Because the story we kept hearing was it was a lot of illegal deforestation, exactly like what you were describing in Turkey. It wasn't sort of by the book. So we were trying to get some sort of insight into when local leaders became more powerful and hence competed with other local leaders to cut down the forest. Did that sort of drive deforestation? And I guess the biggest problem was the satellite data. So we had a PhD student, Stephanie Sieber, and to be honest, we tried for 2 years to do it ourselves and failed. So we weren't able to process all the millions and billions of data points. So that's when we got Matt Hansen and Peter Potapov into the team. And those guys were all remote sensing guys. And since then, we've kind of done a lot of collaboration with people who know how to do that stuff better than we do. Environmentally, you got a much more of a theoretical thing, kind of coming out of public economics, coming out of IO. And what the data does is basically allows you to put a left-hand side variable that you can measure at a very fine level of granularity and then begin to ask questions about policy. Because without that, you can't really say, does this work? Does it not work? Does this drive this? Does it not? So it's a bit of an eye-opener. So I guess the word described is incredibly painful and very, very unsuccessful for several years. But we just kind of loved it and kept going. And
Right.
then
I mean,
eventually,
yeah, I think it was a great idea. So then can we say that, because I was a PhD student back then, so I cannot remember, exactly, but was this one of the first papers that used satellite data for deforestation?
yeah, it was certainly, I think, the first paper in economics. I mean, obviously, there had been lots of, there was lots of papers in Nature and Science, just using satellite data, remote sensing papers. I think it was one of the first papers, certainly the first paper in economics in a top 5 journal that tried to think about what was actually driving that deforestation. So I think that's and there was a few others around that time, but it became sort of a thing because you could just open up stuff you could not look at before. It was like having a lens on the world which was impartial. It's not like the government could affect the way things look like on a satellite image. So that was also incredibly important because the story one heard in Indonesia was that we're following 40-year rotation cycle. We're doing it by the book. And clearly the satellite images were saying, no, that's definitely not what's happening.
And also, when you think about the data collection in terms of environmental economics, it looks like researchers are trying to come up with new data sets, right? It looks like it's going in that direction, different types of, I don't know, measurements of like carbon dioxide, like
Yeah.
emissions and those kinds of things. Can you tell us a bit about the direction of environmental economics is taking?
Yeah, I mean, I think basically in the last 10 years, environmental economics has moved from being primarily theoretical to being primarily empirical. And a big reason for that is that, so if you take one of the most commonly used data sets, which is particulate matter, PM2.5, you can now measure PM2.5 anywhere in the world. And so obviously that's a measure which many people are interested in because it affects health, it affects hospital admissions, all the rest of it. And so you can actually begin to have research designs, for example, that use wind direction, wind speed to kind of provide a kind of treatment variable on a given population, and then use secondary data set on health to think about whether when there was more pollution coming into this part of the city because the wind was flowing from that direction, did you see more hospital admissions for respiratory disease and so on? And there's even cleverer papers now that are measuring the effects of pollution generated in one country for health in another. So it's a very well-known paper by Koichiro Ito of Chicago looking at the impact of Chinese pollution on South Korea. South Korea has very good health records, and you could use the satellite imagery and models of where the wind is flowing when to get sort of a treatment of Chinese pollution on the health of South Korean statistics. And the long and short being that there's quite a considerable effect from the pollution that's generated by China, not South Korea, on the health of.
That is very interesting. I mean, to me, it feels like really researchers in environmental economics, they're being very creative and innovative in terms of like coming up with the data and the methodology. That's really amazing, I'd say. And also, yeah, I mean, you already mentioned that you studied biology. I generally ask people, what made you interested in these areas like environmental economics, etc., and green growth and green innovations? Well, it looks like it's a bit linked to biology a little, but just to tell us, maybe there is someone or something that influenced you to choose this path. Like I said, what happened in your life and how did you choose this path, basically?
I mean, I think a much bigger factor was that my dad was a doctor, my mum was a child nutritionist, and they actually met in Uganda studying kwashiorkor, which is a form of protein malnutrition. So they were both people who had left the UK kind of with a mission to sort of help people in the developing world. And I think that sort of all my family on both sides are doctors. One of my uncles, great uncles, was in the World Health Organization. My dad moved into the World Health Organization. So I was kind of brought up with that. We're both located for the first 8 years in East Africa, and then the US for a year, and then the Philippines for 5 years, and then Italy for 3 years. But definitely with that sort of focus on improving human welfare, I guess, but associated with that also a huge concern with the natural environment and how you can coexist with the natural environment. So obviously climate change at that time wasn't a major issue, but there was a lot of issues with water pollution, air pollution, various types of poisoning. Obviously, just the lack of food and malnutrition, often associated with droughts and floods. So my dad, for example, was responsible for all the refugees from the Biafran War and the Vietnam War. So there was a lot of stuff, partly man-made, partly to do with nature. But it instilled, I guess, a big focus in my life on that relationship between human activity and the natural environment. How could you improve the welfare of both plants and animals and humans at the same time? And that's kind of what's always guided my work. So we were very, I guess, one way to put it, if I joined the City of London and become a banker, that would not have been very popular in my family. It was more of a kind of public service type family.
Right. I was going to ask you, so then when you were studying biology, was it in your mind to kind of connect it with economics, or were you thinking to become a doctor and somehow you changed your mind, let's use statistics and economics and
Yeah, I think it was basically a combination of things. I was studying biology and at Edinburgh University, and all my family is Scottish. And there was a point where I was admitted to do a PhD in the US in biology, and also to Cambridge in the UK. I had a girlfriend in Barcelona at the time, and I was trying to sort of work out, do I really want to be a lab-based scientist for the rest of my life? And I think what really was the counterweight was I was really into development and really into kind of field-based stuff. And so what happened is, quite fortuitously, my dad knew Amartya Sen because of his work on food and nutrition. And Amartya was working with a young Belgian economist called Jean Drèze at the LSE. And I got introduced, and then Jean said I need a research assistant for this book we're writing. And so I, scrambled and applied for the 2-year master's in economics, got admitted, and I didn't have any scholarship, but I used the kind of proceeds from the research assistantship in the first year to kind of transition into economics. So it's basically a kind of confluence of stuff. But Jean was very inspirational, as was Amartya, in terms of how economics could be used very much for the things I was interested in. At that time, I met Nick Stern, became one of my PhD supervisors. So it was a bit of a circuitous route, but it was definitely, I think, coming from what I'd seen as a child, and whether that kind of improvement in human welfare could be done through a lab-based biology PhD or not. And I guess my decision was it could not. So economics seemed like a good language to get into development and environmental stuff.
It looks like, your family background, where you grew up, the field you studied, and then your master's, etc. It looks like it kind of built a new path. How about now? So, I mean, we always talk about in economics, production functions, but what is your production function? So how would you describe it?
The way I work is I have a lot of collaborations. I mean, I call it the movement, and the movement is really about bringing lots of different people to work on this, this big task of sort of having human prosperity improve, but at the same time doing it in a way that's not so damaging to the environment. And so my rule is anything that seems like it's consistent with that, whether that's doing a conference or doing a public lecture or traveling somewhere to advise a government. If I feel like it's going to contribute to that movement, which is also primarily kind of an environmental green growth movement, then I say yes, which means that I travel a lot. But then within the LSE, I have a whole lab, people who work with me on a whole host of things. So anything from a kind of executive director to a research director, right down to a whole lot of pre-docs and PhD students.
Right. And it looks like collaborations. I mean, as you mentioned, that you are the director of lab at the LSE as well. So it looks like it's also kind of directing your research. And you have been also recently, awarded a prestigious ERC grant, which is one of the EU's most competitive funding. So first of all, congratulations. I want to ask you, can you tell us about this grant and its importance, and what projects are you going to work on with this fund? Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah. So the first one, the first ERC was essentially important in setting up the lab. So this is some time ago. I think the first one was like 7 years ago. So 2017, when we came out of COVID, we started to diversify, to bring other people in, professors, say, what should we do work on environmental economics, like Tim Besley, or not necessarily people who identify as environmental economists. And that's become a really big group. So it's moved from about 5 or 6 students to about 26, 27 PhD students. So now one of the major groupings. And from out of that came LSE Environment Week, which is, I think it's 40 academic papers, 3 master lectures and policy sessions, 3 LSE public events, and we're just on the third of those. I think the first grant was really setting up the infrastructure, the lab. The new grant, which is called Innovation and the Environment, InnovM, is really about innovation. So there's sort of 3 groupings. The first set of stuff is all to do with essentially social protection, innovation and social protection. And there we're focusing a lot on this work I did with Oriana on poverty traps and thinking about whether, for example, the graduation program, which is this asset transfer program from the biggest NGO in the world, BRAC, which is mainly in the form of livestock, not only makes people less poor, but does it make them more insulated against shock. So what we've done is overlaid a bunch of satellite data again on droughts and floods, and then we have an RCT running, and then we can look at, did the treated women, were they more resilient to droughts and floods? Because it's both important from an academic perspective because it shows you that policy works, but it's also incredibly important for policy because it means that a whole bunch of programs, which are not currently called climate programs, can be rebadged, and BRAC and other organizations and governments can start to think, what are the social protection policies? So that BRAC is an incredibly innovative NGO, and it works across Africa, Asia, often in the most difficult to work places. So that's sort of one block of stuff. And then in the middle is more of this sort of natural capital deforestation. And the idea there is working with Ben Olkin, who was on the first paper, but also a young assistant professor, Alan Xiao, who is at Stanford, to start to think about this idea of smart conservation. So if you look at Indonesia, the peatland areas, if they burn, the amount of carbon that's released is just enormous. So some days you get more carbon emissions from Indonesia than the US because that area is burning. And so the idea of the smart conservation is, could you design policies where you did more conservation in the high peatland, high carbon areas, and then move the oil palm and other production to non-peatland? So you continue to produce oil palm, but in a way that is much less. And the whole reason that's possible now is exactly this measurement stuff. So you can not only look at emissions and so on, but you can also look at things like productivity, where the peat is, productivity of different crops and so forth. So we felt that was an interesting idea because clearly the tension is between economic development and the international negative public goods of burning up peatland, which obviously is not constrained to Indonesia. So we're thinking a lot and have been working a lot on that paper and a set of papers around that, because you have to respect that the countries like Indonesia want to make their citizens better off. And the difficulty is you can't just sort of say, well, only care about climate. You need to find paths through which are kind of politically feasible, but which present them with a kind of a set of policies which are actually going to produce economic development whilst producing much less environmental externalities. So again, that's a sort of an idea that we've been circling, I guess, and now with this new ERC grant and kind of getting to work with pre-docs and the like. And then the third area, which is with John, is looking at this sort of huge area of clean energy, but specifically on how did China achieve such dominance in the solar industry. So basically, you can think of the Inflation Reduction Act, the New Green Deal in the EU, as being something to do with a reaction against China's dominance in all the green technology. So what we're doing there is essentially a diff and diff paper where different Chinese cities subsidize solar in a different way through production subsidies, through innovation subsidies, and through demand studies, and then just working out using patenting, production, revenue, and export data, what effect did that have? And we're finding basically pretty big effects on these subsidies, which are provided by these city governments, driving up not just production, but also patenting in the solar industry. So we're finding that it's kind of like a detective story on why did the econometrics of why China came to dominate, and seeing that government encouragement was a key part of it. And then in more recent work, we're just starting to look at how did those solar panels and patents then diffuse through the world and change the mix of energy for the production of electricity in different countries, which of course is a big ongoing process. So those are all sort of areas of innovation, but they're quite different in terms of both the people involved and also super different in terms of the methods.
And the way you mentioned actually how the ERC fundings worked so far, that also reminded me the growth stages that we talked with Ufuk Akçil in our first episode. So you start with building the infrastructure first, like just like you did, like you built the lab, you hired the pre-docs and PhD students and postdocs, etc. And then now there are other fundings are coming up, and the lab is actually getting much, much more efficient and producing well. And then now you have other fundings coming up, and you're working on innovation and other kinds of areas. I think that's very interesting. And there is a huge tension right now between economic growth, degrowth, and climate change. But can we also go into that direction and talk about economic growth and how politicians actually benefited from economic growth? Because we know that, for example, when they say, "Oh, our economy is growing by 4% this year," and then they use this as a very positive measure, and people really buy it, and they don't think about where that growth is coming from, and then what the government is doing with all the taxes, and etc. So there are so many things that people don't ask actually. So let's talk about this tension between growth and degrowth and climate change, and then let's go into some policies, what China, for example, is doing or what other countries are doing.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the central tension is that as a political platform, to go into an election saying that you're going to be worse off in 4 years than you are now. As we just saw in the US election, that was a sort of primary issue, that people thought that Trump would make them better off than Harris. So there's a couple of things there. I mean, the one thing is obviously growth, 4% or whatever, is an aggregate concept, whereas poverty or living standards or per capita consumption or whatever is an individual concept. So there is a question of how the aggregate translates into the individual, which is all about distribution. So what drives growth? Making things more productive, and particularly productivity growth is all about using less staff to make more output. And then the other thing is, does growth have to be damaging, which is the core idea. The core idea is that you can produce a unit of output in different ways, which are more or less damaging. So really the whole concept that it looks to have some legs on it is this notion of sustainable or green growth, which does mean that you're producing a unit of output with much less damages, because it's not that growth, there's nothing wrong with growth, but there is something wrong with growth that produces lots and lots of negative externalities. And I think there is some quite complex problems. For example, that the growth that, say, the UK enjoyed and the US enjoyed did result and is resulting in quite serious damages for places that did not enjoy that growth. So that's a global inequality problem, which I think is very difficult from a moral or ethical perspective. But fundamentally, and so there may need to be some global redistribution to deal with that. But I think fundamentally the best way to protect people from environmental damages is to make them better off. And in order to make them better off, there has to be economic growth. How that growth is generated is all about how sustainable, how green. But there is just a fundamental fact that if you're a maize farmer in Malawi, you are being already heavily hit by the environmental externalities from growth and indeed growth going back in many countries. But if you were to move to a better job, you would be less affected. So we have to also think from the perspective of those citizens in Malawi, how are we going to make them better off, which is a development thing. But the twist now is you have to do that development in a much cleaner, less damaging way.
Right. And also, thinking about governments and, countries play an important role in terms of whether they're going to choose this path or not, whether they're going to encourage their industries or firms to invest in, for example, clean energy. There is also an argument saying that, well, you mentioned, for example, the UK or United States, they enjoyed that growth, and in other countries or other nations maybe, suffered. So is it right to say from the developing economy's perspective, like, well, you guys already polluted and became rich. Now why are you throwing away the ladder that that you climbed up with? So do you hear such complaints from politicians in developing economies, like in those areas? And that's why they do not back up and say, well, I'm going to continue investing in these, which you call dirty technologies, but I need growth in my country. So do you observe that tension?
Absolutely, all the time. I mean, that's the standard response in Africa, standard response in India. The difference is that, which is where all the work with John and others is so exciting, is that the alternatives to the polluting or emission heavy growth are becoming much more feasible. And so what we have, I think, is an interesting situation that without the threat of climate change, that the amount of innovation, say, going on wind and solar, just to take the energy part of it, is just so dramatically huge. And it's not just in China, it's happening all over the world in different transportation, how we do everything. And I think as a result, not only is growth going to get cleaner, is that governments will increasingly and firms will increasingly choose those technologies because they're cheaper. But I think the gut reaction, quite correctly, is why on earth are you talking about climate when you created these problems? And that's, of course, extremely true for Malawi and somewhat, but lessingly true for India. But what is also interesting is that for countries like India, they are increasingly thinking about how do we benefit not just from the diffusion of these technologies in India, but actually creating these technologies. And if you take a country, say, like Zambia, who have a lot of copper and cobalt and all these lithium and so on, they're thinking about it from the kind of opposite side of industrial strategy. They're thinking, how do we sort of power the green transition by getting more value added from all these minerals that lie beneath our soil? So everybody's thinking about this game. And I think things like CBAM in the EU are going to push this carbon border adjustment mechanism, are going to push more and more for production to be cleaner. And
what's a CBAM, by the way?
CBAM is a carbon border adjustment mechanism. So it means that when a good enters the EU, they want to make it consistent with the carbon trading system within the EU, so you get taxed at the border to account for the carbon. But you can also reduce the carbon content by doing something in your country, or by imposing a carbon tax in your country. So it's become a force for sort of pushing people who want to export into the EU to clean up production. And the UK is going to introduce one in a few years. The US may or may not introduce one. But there's an increasing sort of sense in which, for many different reasons, countries are going to have to clean up. The obvious one being climate change, but it's a lot more complex than that, because basically the producer of a good within the EU doesn't want to be at a disadvantage relative to, say, a producer of steel in the EU relative to producer of steel in India or China.
I think maybe it should come to a point maybe where firms can say that, well, if I don't choose this path, since we think that, firms are very much concerned about their profits, if they think that there is a high demand for clean energy or like clean products, and if they think that they're not going to be able to, sell, or they're not going to be able to make agreements with Europe, with the European like firms, for example, without making any investments in green areas, then they're pushed to do that. So maybe that's one way maybe CBAM is going forward. Am I understanding it correctly?
Yeah, it's basically like a kind of incipient carbon tax, because it just, the advantages of then imposing a carbon tax in your country goes up, because then you can take the revenue in your country and then export, whereas if you export directly, the EU gets the revenue. So I think there's a couple of things there. One is obviously that the firms, if say, if we take the case of energy is not typically created by a firm. But if you step one step back from that, it does create a much bigger incentive to create your energy from non-carbon sources, and that's I guess where I'm on the energy front the most interested. Just what are the factors that affect the rate of diffusion of renewables into the electricity generation system? Because once you have that going, then you can just, the path forward is very, very, very clearly to electrify everything. So electrify transport, electrify all sorts of heating, all the kind of stuff that, that firms use, that households use. If that can come from clean energy, then you're really far down the road. And obviously that also has the advantage of having less local pollution and less particulates and all those things. So there's a lot of, I guess, the thing that's not clearly seen by people, there's actually some very big advantages in terms of the quality of amenity, the quality of life in cities and so on, that will come from the drive to clean up the energy sector. You can sort of begin to see it in London. It's not quite there, but there's a gradual drift towards EVs. There's certainly much more efficient cars because of the congestion. There's a lot more bikes, a lot more electric bikes. So these things will gradually sort of clean up London to a point that hopefully when we're commuting in and out, we're not imbibing lots of particulate matter.
Sometimes I'm thinking, for example, I remember from my parents, like in 1950s or 60s, they didn't have electricity, and I'm sure there are countries or areas where they don't even have electricity. So, well, this is for the maybe developed economies, but producing maybe electrified vehicles, those kinds of things are pretty nice. But at the same time, in some areas, people don't even have maybe electricity right now. So there is one thing that I was thinking about.
For a lot of people, primarily now in Africa, I think in the last 10 years, about 80% of the new connections to electricity were in India alone. So there's been a huge surge in just electrifying lots of people. But that does seem to be incredibly important, because for the one big reason which we talked about before, which is jobs. There's very few jobs that you can do if you go back to your grandparents and so on without electricity. You can do farming, you can do some food processing, but the moment you want to kind of create any kind of firm of any size with specialization of labor, you need electricity, and you need it on an assured basis. So what that means is that first step of given that it's a network structure, if it's going through the grid, it's a little bit of a kind of a bet that countries are making, that it won't just end and everybody's still growing maize and cassava and not doing anything else. It's kind of like, if you don't do that, if you say take Turkey, many jobs and firms that came up in Turkey wouldn't have come up had the country not been electrified. Or even more strikingly, in South Korea, where I'm working now, if you go back to sort of post-Korean War, similar situation and not much electrification, the value of that early electrification, combined with road building and so forth, railway building, was enormous. You moved the country from a low to a high income country, probably the fastest move ever made by any country. And a lot of that to do with just like getting the infrastructure right. And of course, that wasn't necessarily clean electricity. That wasn't a big concern. But I don't think you don't want to forget about how important it is for any type of proper job or any type of proper firm to have electricity. Just very few things you can do without.
Right. Those are very important points. So maybe we can continue some of the policies that you think, work the best in the past or right now.
I think one thing I should have mentioned is that as an academic, looking towards my PhD students and pre-docs, the interest in policy of the new generation, like yourself, in policy is typically like much, much, much higher than when I was a PhD student. So when I was a PhD student, like theory was king. You could do good theory. That was sort of the best you could do. And I think that reflects two things. One is that people are just much, much more interested in policy. They're just, they're partly into economics because they want to affect policy, but also just become more feasible because there's been many, many more organizations like International Growth Center, like JPAL, who are all about kind of having frontier economics move into policy. So I guess what I find is that I learn a lot about what policy might work, more kind of the other way around by listening to policymakers and them telling me, this worked and this didn't work. But of the sort of set that are out there right now, I think the policies around renewables and the diffusion of renewables is probably the most successful set of policy. And it's not at all specific to developing countries. If you take this country, the flattening of the emissions in the UK are largely to do with offshore wind. And that's obviously the technology that was developed in many places, including China, but also in other territories. So how that got into the electricity sector in this country, how it's now getting into the electricity sector in many different countries, with Europe very much leading in that respect. That does seem like a real concrete, because it not only is clean, but it's also an area where it's part of the kind of industrial strategy of many countries to generate those sorts of green technologies. I think that on the energy side, probably the renewable, both the innovation and the diffusion, feels super important, working well, and that's probably the biggest one. In terms of other policies, I think the ones that we don't know how to do so well, but seem like they should be important, are carbon markets. So I've been working UK Climate Change Committee, Reenen at Yale, and just trying to sort of think about voluntary carbon markets, which have been touted as this big thing, but how could you generate sort of stronger international carbon markets? So, for example, say Google, because they're creating a lot of AI or whatever, want to buy an offset in the Congo or somewhere. So that would be about, say, protecting a bit of forest in the Congo, which contains a bunch of carbon. That seems like a trade that should happen. Google's got the money. This bit of the forest might get cut down. It turns out that's quite a difficult market design because you have to kind of authenticate the offset. And so I think there's a couple of things there. One is that how to make these markets work is obviously an interesting, important area. And also how we can move from voluntary to compliance markets. So things like the EU trading system have been having a positive effect, but it's a compliance market. You have to comply with that. And I think that's something where these carbon border taxes are probably pushing towards. And indeed, if you just look at a map of the world and you say which places in the world have some form of carbon taxes, there's been quite a rapid spread, and China's getting much more serious about this. So I think that's an area that's sort of in development. India's doing a lot of voluntary carbon markets, and they would like to move into compliance markets. That feels like it could be a very, very big deal. And then I guess the third bit, which is also work in progress, and maybe even more work in progress, is the kind of elephant in the room on damages, international damages. So how do we protect populations that have played no part in the generation of these, or a very limited part in the generation of these externalities? What sorts of policies would work in that respect? So there's many different, you have to find a funding source. So you've heard since Glasgow, 100 billion, loss and damage fund. You hear these sorts of numbers, and a lot of people saying what's actually happening. We had Pakistan floods. They didn't seem to be getting a lot of assistance. So I think that the sort of design of almost international institutions that are up to the job of getting some flow of funds to affected populations. So you need a funding source, you need a mechanism for transferring that money, you need a way of identifying the people who need it, is also very, very important. My own sense of that is it's going to come probably more from the two things. One is just people getting better off and has been less exposed to these types of shocks. That seems like a very credible thing. You can sort of almost see visibly happening in countries like India, but also probably just governments getting smarter in the design of their domestic policy. So, what we saw in Spain recently is an example where the government was completely unprepared. So it's not, I don't think it's just about money flowing. It's also about state capacity, where the governments are prepared. And they probably need new institutions that will be thinking about how prepared they are for many of these shocks, which are often hitting parts of a country which maybe hadn't experienced a drought or a flood. I think that area again seems super important and very much work in progress. But it is, I think, also very important not to view populations that are being affected by climate damages as sort of victims. There's an awful lot that can be done to improve their lot, but there's no doubt that there is a big moral, ethical issue about the fact they didn't generate those damages and they're being affected by those damages, and how one squares that circle. It could be, for example, by greater diffusion of technologies that allow growth, particularly clean growth. It could be some of the stuff that we're describing with BRAC, where you use various asset transfer and various types of transfer programs in a smarter way to get to the population so that they're more protected from these shocks. But I sense that overall, on all three of those areas, there's a lot of hope and there's a lot of innovation happening. So I think it feels like universities like the LSE and organizations like the IGC and so on are now feeling like this is what we got to do. It's kind of like sustainable growth, but thinking from a global perspective, because poverty was much more of we have a poor population in the country, we have a set of policies that we could do to affect that population. This is a very different thing, because if you drive a car in Egypt or Turkey, you're affecting people elsewhere in the world. Or if you burn down a part of the forest in Greece or California, ditto. So I think it does feel like maybe a little bit more of a kind of joining up force, and certainly within economics, environment, climate change has really begun to kind of coalesce economics, because many different types of economics, many different fields of economics, from macro, finance, public, people are all bearing down on these issues. So it's a very, very exciting place to be.
It is. I am actually, I mean, thank you very much for mentioning all these, different aspects. And well, first of all, I would also maybe add to the list you mentioned, like maybe collaboration with political science
Yeah.
as well, because it's very much related to also the political incentives. Actually, when you were talking, I was just thinking about this. Maybe instead of, we talked about being, victimized by the situation and whether, the responsibilities, etc. Maybe instead of creating a story in terms of like the global like climate problem, maybe it could be more nationalized. For example,
Mm-hmm.
instead of saying, oh, we're trying to save the world that these big advanced economies polluted, instead of that, maybe they could just say, well, we're saving, for example, the Turkish forests, or
Yeah.
I feel like this could work. I mean, well, I don't like nationalism notion that much, but it looks like it could work in this case. Again, when it comes to environment and how political science and such language maybe can affect and change people's behavior. And sometimes I'm also thinking we talk about governments, but like as individuals, for example, when it comes to recycling, I think there are so many things that could be done, and governments, even local municipalities, for example, they could maybe create green jobs related to, I don't know, recycling and those kinds of things. So I think maybe governments or local municipalities maybe should be also aware of the fact that you can create, job growth with new jobs, related to clean energy or, these types of areas. Okay, so let's sum it up with some cheesy questions. One of the questions that I want to ask you first is, you also mentioned that you travel a lot.
Yeah.
What does traveling teach you?
Yeah. I mean, I travel in two ways. I travel firstly, like for work, so to go and meet. So I'm headed to India in December to set up a collaboration with the Indian Statistical Institute on sustainable growth. That will mean meeting people in the government, going up to Bihar, which is one of the poorest states in India, to look at an attempt to do kind of urban climate resilience and giving small businesses to people who live under flyovers. So that bit will be like field based. I'll be wandering around, I'll be sort of seeing what these people's lives look like. The Delhi bit of that is going to be like going to offices, doing talks, but actually kind of knitting together a program of research, which does feel like it's actually wanted by not just the government, but private sector, and there'll be different players in the room. So part of the value of that travel, I don't know, it'd be very difficult to do that knitting together and have dinner, that kind of stuff on Zoom. You could do some of it because you need to kind of be really getting a feel of what's wanted. So those meetings would be partly like in a room at the Statistical Institute with lots of people, 4 areas, firms, cities, energy, states, and so on. What can we do in India? And interesting, a lot of that research will be done by people at Indian universities because they have good universities there, and you want to kind of develop capacity in environmental economics in India so people can kind of go into government, they can stay in university and so on. But that's a kind of more planning, policy, field work, and I find it kind of, I think, basically impossible to do without going there. The field-based stuff's very different because there you're doing 2 things. You're getting a feel of what the problem is, the lives these people look like, and these are populations who are essentially living under a flyover in a very basic slum, and then suddenly they're hit by this 50-degree weather, and they're poorly adapted to doing that. They're penniless and so on. That is very different because it's a field thing, but it's also thinking how do you design the intervention. So then you're with, in this case, it's a government program, and you're actually thinking of what could help these people, what's going to be the design of the randomized control trial. So those are 2 examples of forms of travel. And I think it was in February or March, I was in Zambia talking to the Zambian president. What can Zambia do with all their mineral wealth? How can they have this sort of industrial strategy? I mean, those are things where they're looking for somebody who knows something about economics, something about policies, so that they can guide their own policies. And obviously, they're talking to lots of people and they're sovereign in terms of policy. But that also is very interesting because Zambia is not a country I've done any work in. So there it's just stock of knowledge. It's like I've done a lot of work in Uganda, I've done a lot of work in some other African countries. So you're just trying to be helpful. But I think those sort of policy field things are very, very distinct. So I spent a lot of time in the field last summer in Bangladesh looking at climate and how that's affecting very poor women there. But I think that the 4th type, which is personal travel, is done basically with my 2 kids and my wife. And we basically try to go away for about 3 weeks a year to some far-flung place, often where I'm doing some work, so we've been to Myanmar, Vietnam, India, Korea, and so forth. And that's completely different because that's sort of through the lens of children and partner and just seeing different things. And I think they're all very distinctive, but often the research can come from the 4th type because it's a more open thing. You're not just sat in a hotel meeting policymakers in an office or a government department, or in a field where you're being shepherded around by some NGO or government. When you're just traveling for traveling's sake. So in India, we went to Varanasi, Delhi, and Cochin, and in very different parts of India. And you just got a sort of sense of what modern India looked like, what's happening on the streets, what did the transportation look like, And I think that sort of open-ended travel, which I guess typically is more common when you're younger, is super valuable because it's not got really that objective, and you're sort of inside a country looking around. Like Myanmar was fascinating. I was partly there for work, but then we traveled around a lot, and you got a real sense. This was before the coup, the military came back in. You got a country, a sense of a country full of hope, things really happening. So I think all 4 types are great, but it's very. You can also go too far because the traveling for seminars and keynotes and all that, which is like hotel in America, give the talk, come back. If you add all that up, it's a lot of time. And so
Exactly.
you need to kind of, I prefer to kind of do like a work trip combined with a sort of field trip, and I think like I'm doing in India. So I'm going to go there with my oldest daughter, and then do Delhi, and then do Bihar, and then do some stuff with her. And that's all going to happen in a kind of 2-3 week period. But that sort of 2 blocks of those a year is more than enough.
I see. Because I was going to ask you about your time management skills. So would you have any tips or advice to people about, time management?
I mean, basically, I'm like incredibly disorganized. I would describe. I mean, like astonishingly disorganized. So what I do is I'm sort of driven by interest with research. So what I will do is I'll have a team. So say I'm working with Oriana on something, there'll be a team, there'll be some PhD students, there'll be some pre-docs, and there'll be a time where we meet and we look at stuff, we advance the project. And often people will be coming, which is why I have this crazy system in my office of the enormous television screen. There'll often be like somebody from India or somebody from Uganda or wherever. So I find like if and often me not putting those times in, but somebody's putting those times in so that I know that even if I don't think about this at all, then on Wednesday at 11 a.m. we're talking to Bangladesh. Then I know that project will move on, and that's typically because I'm really into that project, but I probably haven't done anything from week to week, right? So that's one method. Is you just have it's like a kind of a lab-based approach to projects, and then I also have a lot of meetings with my executive director, research director, and so forth, I kind of delegate some stuff. But to be honest, I'm not very good at that. So I basically rely on people who are very good at that. And then they essentially manage me. And then they'll also say, like, I want to meet up with X, and somebody will arrange that. So basically what I do is I kind of use a lot of voicemails. And as things that interest me happen, I try to get them into some system where something will happen, because I know that on my own, I'm never going to do any of that stuff. So it's a lot of delegation, but it's the way I would describe it. The most it's like every day I'm swimming along, looking at things, and then I look, oh, this looks really interesting, and then I go down into that bit, and then I get lost in there and just completely forget about time. So what's critical for me actually is actually making the meetings very, very concentrated, and then having big blocks of time. So I try to have at least sort of 2.5 days where there's not, meeting. And I never achieve this, but there'd be some theory that there's no meetings, that I can just swim all day and see what happens. Because that's how you do research. You kind of swim, you see what happens, and you decide what to do.
Yeah.
So I'm actually quite anti-meetings. I mean, unless they're ones that I'm really into the project, or with people I really trust are going to make my life much more productive by making sure the things that have to happen, particularly in the policy side, getting into policy, you need a lot of expertise, which I don't have. I need to have meetings set up. Policy is a very ordered thing. You have to know who are the key people. You need to meet with them. You need to be able to explain yourself. So recently I've been meeting a lot of people in the environmental policy arena in the UK, because with the Labour government, it feels like, what's happening in America, that the UK is in a strong position to lead on some environmental policy. But it's a new thing for me, so I need to kind of talk to a lot of people in the Treasury and that zero thing about who to talk to. And I find that fascinating, because I'm really into understanding what they're trying to do, and indeed, place pre-docs in these places, start research. I'm very open-ended. I'm not at all sort of, it has to be developed this field or that. I just sort of go for whatever I'm interested in.
That would maybe summarize, so far with all the guests that I talked to, they all say, like, love what they do. And that's, I think, the sense that I'm getting from you as well.
Yeah.
I mean, you just love it and you find it fascinating. And the example that you gave, like a fish, It was also like a very nice and an ecological one that you dive in and then you get lost, which I think is really, really important. And I hope everyone feels the same way with their jobs. Thank you very much, Robin. It was a great talk. Maybe over time, I don't know, with Donald Trump and with the UK government, like how their relationship is going and the environmental policies, maybe we can do another episode. But I'm so happy to have you here. Thank you very much for sharing your opinions and your life with us.
Thank you.
See you in the next episode, everybody. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.